Hello and welcome back to News of the Week. This week, I want to raise this aspect that you have probably all heard about when it comes to the negotiations or lack of negotiations about the debt ceiling in the United States. Right now, the Treasury Department has said that the current limit that the Congress had actually approved of $31.4 trillion, which is a number that is so way beyond any comprehension, but it has been reached sometime in January. And if it is not extended higher, then there will come a point, some people say on 1st of June, others say in July or August, where access to more money to pay bills is just not going to be there in a sufficient amount. Now, the government keeps getting money in from taxes and other sources, but it's never enough to pay for everything, so they constantly have to tap into new debt. Imagine you had a credit card and your credit card company gives you a certain limit, and while you are going from year to year, every time when you get about a certain amount into the year, your credit card is fully maxed out and you're struggling to pay, and you're calling the credit card company and say, okay, I reached my limit again. Now you need to increase it. Now, sometimes it takes you a year, sometimes it takes you 2 years to reach the new limit because you're always spending more than you're actually taking in, and you never really have a chance to pay anything back. So you always only make the minimum payment, and mainly that is interest. That's how the government is basically acting. Now, why is this whole thing about the debt ceiling a critical thing? It has to do with the fact that the United States, having the reserve currency for the last 80 years, has been able to go out and give out US Treasury notes that say, okay, you give me $100 and I give you back $100 in 2 years plus 1%, 2%, 3% interest. That interest rate is always related to the current Federal Reserve funds exchange rate. And as you all know, since about the spring of 2022, so a little more than a year, the Federal Reserve has massively increased interest rates. So we are now slightly above 5%. Now, the government doesn't have to pay those full 5% on their treasury notes. I would guess right now, the average is probably between 2 and 3%. But if you think about it, 3% on 31 trillion is already 1 trillion. Right? So they have to pay 1 trillion just to pay interest, just like my example with the credit card. Now, normally, if you get into that kind of a situation and you're willing to step back and say, what am I doing? How am I actually using the budget? How am I running my business? Just like the government should, you would come to the conclusion you're spending too much. You're not putting enough in. You can barely make the interest payments and you're not coming down from the debt. And don't listen to any of the information where any politician said, we reduce the debt. That's not really true. They use that. They say this all the time, all the way up to the president, but they don't reduce the debt. They really only reduce the amount of debt they're taking on. So to give you an example on that one, in the COVID years, there were several programs where in 1 year, $2 trillion of new debt of that 31.4 that we're at right now had been added. 2 trillion in 1 year. So if in the next year, only 1.5 trillion of new debt is done, you haven't reduced the debt, you added 1.5, but it's 500 billion less than the year before. And so politicians are running around telling you in the media every opportunity they get that they reduce the debt or the deficit by $500 billion. What they should say is we're taking less debt on than last year, but we're still taking debt on. Long story short, the problem really is if you go to any place in the world and say, I want to give you my treasury bills, you give me money for that, so I have basically that money to spend in my country. That's what the United States has done. And we are now at a point where the amount of debt and the service to the debt is more at some people say 115 to 130%. It's more than the whole activity, the gross domestic product of the country is generating. That is very unhealthy and normally leads to a certain collapse in the future. Why could the United States do this at this absolutely massive level? Mainly because it's the reserve currency. And to be the reserve currency and remain to be the reserve currency, you have to have the trust of the other people, other countries around the world that are giving you those $100 bills whenever you give them a treasury bill. Now, like anything, even though countries don't really in the traditional sense have credit scores, they have ratings too. And the rating of how trustworthy and creditworthy a country is depends on their behavior. Have they defaulted before? Have they basically not paid their bills before? Have they run their economy into the ground before? And so one of the reasons the United States has always been seen as one of the safest places to buy treasury bills and make those investments is because it has never defaulted. So this whole discussion around the debt ceiling is if the debt ceiling isn't raised, and so therefore there is no more additional money to be paying back the interest and the bills and stuff like that the government accumulated, then the biggest impact will be that the rest of the world is going to lose trust. If you want to, the credit score, if it were a person, or in this case, the credit rating, will massively go down. And the consequence of that is if we in the future go out and say we want to sell you treasury bills, everybody will say, well, since I can't be sure that you're really paying, just see what happened last year, you need to give me more. So money will become more expensive. And certain places in the world might say, we don't want to give you any more money until you get this situation fixed. What's the impact to us as investors? Obviously, for continued investing, we are required, at least I believe that's the right way to put it, to get funding from the banks. Now, there is always a ratio between how much does the bank need to pay for money to the government and how much do we then pay the bank, and the bank makes a profit on the difference. If the money gets more expensive for banks and lending institutions because the government is not able to actually issue money anymore at the same low rates, then it will get more expensive to us. It's also harder to attract anybody from the rest of the world to invest in the United States if the trust is going down to get paid back because the government has certain things in place that seem to not be automatic. And I would say, using the analogy of the credit card, you don't really want your debt limit to be automatic. Like the current president is saying, it has been raised 78 times, it should be raised again. That's basically you arguing to your credit card company, hey, you guys have raised my credit limit 78 times in the last 20 years. Now I need it again and again and again, and never really addressing that you're putting on more and more debt without ever really getting to a point to repay something or live within your means. So I can understand that there is a real conflict about it when one side says, well, we can't keep doing this, and the other side says, well, we have been doing it 78 times, and so we should just keep doing it. So that's kind of the situation. But for you as investors, as listeners, as watchers of our videos, podcasts, and audios, I want you to be aware that this loss of trust will make things more expensive, both on prices, meaning I believe we would see higher inflation if this doesn't end up with a compromise, and we will lose trust internationally, so money will be more expensive. So that's why this is relevant, and that's why I want you to pay attention to it. Now, the other thing is, if the US dollar and the US government lose trust, one of the reserves that I always preach we should have in a diversified portfolio would be gold and silver coins and things like that. Those will typically go up when these kind of situations occur, especially if we don't have a good solution. And don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that a good solution is just to say, let's raise it to 35 trillion or 40 trillion or stuff. I believe there should be some plan on how to address the situation and not just go year after year after year and increasing the limit. But on the other hand, if they don't find a compromise, the consequences, at least in the short term, could be worse. So be vigilant, stay safe, be well, pay attention to this thing, and I see you next week in the next video.